Disability theology is different religious traditions looking at the concept and theme of disability, and that can be done through a range of different lenses and approaches. So for example, some scholars are using disability and looking at disability through biblical texts and scripture. Some of my colleagues are looking at disability through an ethical framework or paradigm. My particular approach is perhaps a little bit different in the sense that I use or utilise a practical theological method to determine how inclusive a particular faith community, whether that be a school or a parish or a Catholic social care agency, is actually including people living with disability. So in the past I've used a range of different qualitative research methodologies to be able to achieve that aim. Yeah, so when we look at disability studies or the study of disability, it has evolved quite significantly across time. And even it wasn't so long ago when we were talking about the medical or clinical model of disability, where we understood someone living with a disability would often present him or herself to a medical professional or a clinician. And typically the way of thinking was that you're not fit to be in society, so we'll remove you from your society in which you live. And often the case was they would be locked up in very draconian institutions. So thank God the historical development has shifted somewhat from that particular practice. So nowadays, in 2018, we experience more the social or empowerment model of disability, and the best way I like to describe it is through an analogy or an example. So if you have a 10-storey building in somewhere in Aotearoa and a person in a wheelchair needed to get to, say, the 7th floor. If that particular building didn't have a means for that person to get to the 7th floor, the social or empowerment model of disability would understand that the building or the organisation or organisations that inhabit the building, whether they own the building or just rent it or what have you, it's actually them that have the disability, not the person in the wheelchair. So you can see how the thinking has almost changed quite extensively, and it puts the onus back on society really, and really creates an ambience where we're thinking in a more person-centred way. And I think if we align this with theology, we can think there's many stories in the Gospels where Jesus the Christ was very concerned about the other, okay? And one particular example comes to mind. It's probably my favourite story in the Gospel, is the one that we find in Luke 14, the story of the great banquet, where Jesus tells the people that when you host a dinner or a dinner party or a banquet, do not invite the rich or the elite or the high people in society. Invite the disabled, the lame, the blind, the lepers, and your particular occasion, your dinner party, will be blessed abundantly, and you will be blessed abundantly through that particular practice. So I think that could be perhaps a good way to link up or marry up disability studies and theology somehow, and it might be an interesting or informative way to think about it. Yeah, so the church has a really central and important role for caring for people living with disability. Even if you look at our biblical foundation of our faith, we hear in Genesis chapter 1 that we're all created in the image and likeness of God. And that means everyone, not just a select few, everyone. So that means that our particular outreach needs to obviously include people living on the margins and on the peripheries. And certainly if you look in different sections of the Catholic Church, people living with disability are certainly on the margins. So really my aim is to increase that particular awareness and build the confidence and capacity within people, Catholic school teachers, people working within Catholic parishes, even our clergy, to be able to be armed with the particular skills and tools to be able to interact on a meaningful level with people living with a disability. Yeah, the difference between inclusion and belonging is a really important question really to investigate because both terms are equally are important, but I would argue that when we're talking about people living with disability, that we're on about something more than just including them in our parishes or schools or social care agencies or settings or what have you. In that inclusion, it's a really easy thing to achieve when we look at it. So if we look at the example of, a Catholic church in terms of the architectural building, all we really need to do to include someone perhaps living in a pushchair or a wheelchair is to include a means of accessibility for that particular person to get into the church, into the place of worship. So that might be through perhaps a ramp or some other assisted mobility device or something like that. And that's obviously important for that particular person who does live and share life in a wheelchair. But I would argue that meanwhile that's important, well, what we should be on about or aiming for is a true sense of belonging. So it takes on a more deeper and profound form. So my good friend John Swinton from the University of Aberdeen in Scotland, he says that belonging is something that takes form when someone's actually missed. So, for example, if you had a good friend who regularly attended a Sunday service at your local parish and he or she wasn't there for any particular reason, you as that person's friend actually miss them. You actually long for their presence in your life at that particular time. So you can see that it's not just including them in the parish, it's actually missing them when they're not there. So I think if we can be aiming in our particular context to cultivate an atmosphere or an environment where we're not only just including people with disability, we're actually creating genuine and authentic places of belonging. And I think it's only through that we can achieve a true Catholic Christian community. Yeah, I think when we talk about whether the Catholic Church is doing enough in this particular area, the way I describe it, or certainly the way I describe my doctoral thesis, was that it's like a patchwork quilt. In that particular settings, whether it's parishes or schools, they're doing really wonderful, creative and innovative things around including people living with disability. But then on the other side of the coin, we see reported examples where disability isn't even on the radar of clergy, Catholic schools, Catholic social care agencies and so forth. So really it's about creating a space where everyone has the confidence and capacity to be able to have a meaningful engagement with someone living with disability and really celebrating the gift of disability more than once a year. One other thing that I see from time to time is we see the United Nations International Day for Persons Living with Disability, which is celebrated on the 3rd of December every year. And typically in the lead up to that particular event, we'll see different Catholic parishes or perhaps dioceses or schools or so forth. They'll put out a colourful, glossy document that says that we do inclusion or belonging well here. And while that's important to a certain extent, really we should be aiming for celebrating the gift of disability more than just that one time in that year, in that it should become ordinary that we have members within our parishes who are living with disability. If we're in schools, we should be welcoming enrolments of children living with special needs and other particular disabilities. And other examples in other Catholic settings and agencies as well. So really I think it's important that we are encouraging the gift of disability all year round.